Welcome back to the Connected podcast. I'm thrilled to bring you an extraordinary collection in which some incredible students take the driver's seat and host dynamic conversations with professionals from across the higher education sector, discussing the vital topic of student belonging. I'm excited to welcome back Felicity Rush. In today's episode, Felicity is talking to Anjali Mehta Chandar, an experienced CBT therapist and lecturer in clinical psychology at the Charlie Waller Institute at the University of Reading. Anjali talks to Felicity today about her research into student belonging and how this is impacted by race representation in the staff team in higher education.
So, Anjali, your project, can you explain what student belonging means in the context of higher education, and why is it really important for student success?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there are so many different definitions of student belonging, particularly in higher education contexts. But kind of the definition we really went with was all around focused around how students perceive that social support on campus, that kind of feeling of connectedness and feeling matter and you're cared about, feel a sense of belonging. And that's crucial for their success, because we know that if students don't have a strong sense of belonging, there's often linked to lower attainment levels. So, how good their grades are essentially, and also their retention. So how long or likely they are to stay on a course. So we know sense of belonging is really important. And we also know that those from more minoritized ethnic backgrounds tend to have kind of lower levels of all of those factors. And so we really were, thinking about race representation as a very important factor in student success as well.
Of course. So, what are some key factors that influence their sense of belonging on campus, and how does racial representation, particularly among faculty and staff, shape that experience?
I think there's so many factors that influence a student's sense of belonging, and there's research to show that it can be to do with things like the class of like as in whether some middle class, upper class, etc., in terms of their peers and the faculty members. It can be down to if they're seeing representation with age or their gender. But what we have found is that actually ethnicity tends to trump that a little bit, and it tends to be kind of really important for sense of belonging. And we know that to achieve that sense of belonging, it largely comes from building relationships, and actually that, whether that's with kind of having diverse mentors or opportunities to network with other people that are from similar ethnic groups. It's whether the course content is culturally relevant as well, or reflects like the diverse histories that exist. But sometimes, and often with the psychology world, we find that a lot of it is perhaps more from a Western point of view. And then there's the other thing, sort of whether there's implicit bias kind of against certain cultural groups, or microaggressions or discrimination as well. And so, racial representation is really going to shape that experience about how someone feels that sense of belonging, that sense of connectedness and feeling like they matter. Because if they're experiencing microaggressions, they're not going to feel that sense of belonging, or if they don't have access to people that look like them, either in terms of their peers or faculty members, they're just not going to feel like they fit in. And then that affects the other things, like we said, like retention onto courses, things like that.
Yeah, and I guess in some uni situations, if you're going to maybe a very rural, small uni, you might not find the race representation as well as, say, a bigger city uni, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. That can happen. And then also thinking about not just the students in that, but also the staff as well. I guess it works both ways, right?
Yeah.
So you want to have diversity in both of those elements. So yeah, that could absolutely be a factor.
So how does your research address the disparities in belonging among the diverse student groups, and what role does the staff diversity play in these disparities?
Yeah, so if I take us a little bit back to like why we did that research, to give it some context, essentially. So there was a race review kind of document that came out in 2021 by the University of Reading, that is. And they noticed that students sometimes felt isolated, and that sometimes lacked a sense of belonging within the university. And they realised that often that was due to a lack of staff representation in terms of race. And so, we really, as a research group, we really want to think, okay, well, let's delve a bit deeper into that. Let's see how our students in our particular department feel as well. And for a bit of context, our department is a sub-department within psychology, and we are training mental health practitioners.
Oh.
And so we're really curious. Yeah, so they're mostly postgrad students and sort of, training in a very vocational course. And so we wanted to see, okay, what else, what can we do then as well? What are the implications from this training in terms of what we need to consider as a staff team in terms of diversity and racial representation and things. So we did a survey where we had 16 students participate, and we did a couple of interviews as well. And it was a mix of ethnicities involved. It wasn't only those from a minority ethnicity. And we did sort of thematic analysis on it all. And we did find that there was a link between race representation and sense of belonging, which is no surprise. That's what we know in the literature anyway. And our students said that if they felt that sense of belonging, or those of them that did, also found that they had increased confidence, they felt safe, they felt relaxed, they felt they could overcome setbacks in the course as well. And they appreciated it when staff showed cultural awareness and when there was diversity within the team, but some of them found that wasn't always the case, that wasn't always present. And it's worth noting as well that they, some students actually talked about holistic diversity, so not just race, although our study was very much about that, but they talked about diversity in terms of age, class, gender, etc. And also how important it is that the curriculum content is diverse, and as well as that even if staff are from, a majority white background, that actually they're culturally aware, and that they're aware of other cultures and bringing that in. And I think it's worth noting as well that in our research, 3 out of the 4 of us who did the research are from minoritized ethnic backgrounds ourselves. And we were a mix of students and staff doing this research. So we kind of had the student perspective within that as well, and a couple of our staff members.
Yeah, so you had a good sort of lineup of diversity in terms of, well, you were very well represented as a research team.
Yeah, and I think, we all probably wanted to do that research because of our own experiences as well. So I mean, as a lecturer, I've had a student before. I myself am Asian and Indian, and I had an Indian student come up to me and say that it was very refreshing to see an Indian lecturer because they'd never thought that they could do, or, become a lecturer themselves. So seeing a lecturer from their own background, was very sort of helpful in that. And I reflect back on when I was training in a student, I had a Indian lecturer as well. And although I didn't realise it at the time, actually it was really nice to see someone from the same background as me, and that probably helped me then to feel able and comfortable to go into lecturing myself. So I think a lot of us had that kind of personal, I don't know what the word is, but interest, I guess, in doing research like this, for sure.
Yeah. So were there any specific strategies or programs that institutions that you think can implement to foster a greater sense of belonging, particularly for those students from racially underrepresented backgrounds?
Absolutely, yeah. So we were really keen in our research to come up with some implications and some strategies that our own team could use, but also to share that so other teams might also feel that they can utilise it too. So we came up with 6 different things. I'll try and rattle through them relatively quickly. But one thing was sort of an openness in how we introduce ourselves as lecturers. So when we first meet a cohort, or first teach them, have that space to just have a bit of a dialogue with them, to just sort of share our own protected characteristics, and also the routes to becoming an academic as well, just so that they can visualize it for themselves potentially. I mean, we're not training lecturers, we're not training them to become lecturers, but it can still just really help them to see that, we're not necessarily that different from them. I think there can be this idea that, lecturers, all have a PhD and all did a certain thing, and I don't have a PhD. That's I'm very much a clinical lecturer. I teach what I studied, kind of thing. So you don't need a PhD for that. So it can be really useful to just share and be really open in those introductions. Another one was showing that cultural awareness. So maybe we acknowledge cultural events in lectures. If you're using, we call it Blackboard, but essentially whatever platform where you put up your slides and all the information for the course, having announcements on there that show that cultural awareness as well, or whether it's just even simply emails that go out to the students. Having some kind of discussion blog where lecturers can share what it's like to be a professional from a minoritized background, and to really help our students to see that they're not alone, and that they've got they're working with lecturers who are very potentially very similar to themselves. And as mentioned, like those teaching resources, making sure that we are really decolonizing the curriculum and diversifying the teaching materials, just to that, we're not just using examples that the majority perhaps of the class can relate to, but everybody can relate to. It's really important. And then in terms of, if you're doing academic tutorials with students, discussing belonging really explicitly, like open discussions and creating that safe space, and discussing diversity and race. So kind of both of those elements really. Because I know that one of our participants in our research did actually say, I think I had a tutor with the same kind of ethnic background as myself, but we never discussed it. And that gave them that they didn't quite feel that sense of belonging as much as they could have if there was a really open dialogue. And same with me. I mean, my tutor was Indian as well when I was studying, and actually we never spoke about it. I assume they're Indian. I don't even know 100% for sure, but kind of assumed that they are from what I know of them. And so if we'd had like open dialogues about it, I might have felt even more that sense of belonging when I studied. So yeah, they're kind of our recommendations really.
Yeah. So you talked a bit about sort of the role that the staff and faculty can play in creating an environment. How can institutions ensure more representative staffing, and what
Yeah.
role will this play in belonging?
Yeah, I think it's going to play a really crucial role in belonging because there's absolutely that link between having a representative staff team and sense of belonging. And I think institutions to get, more representative staffing, I think, well, it comes down to hiring diverse staff and retaining them. So, it's about ensuring that the levels or the ratios that you have of staff from minoritized ethnic backgrounds kind of mirrors the percentages you see in society. So it kind of reflects that nicely. And the same with the student body. You want, a representative sample or in terms of race. It's about kind of putting, I think, equity, diversity, inclusion kind of elements within the job descriptions and the adverts, and even in the interview process to have questions that ask about those things. So it's, it is something you kind of have to be be able to demonstrate and talk about. And that doesn't mean you've got to say you've come from one of those backgrounds to pass that question, but it's about even just having that cultural awareness of it. But yeah, and then positive kind of outreach and really thinking around how can we target people. Again, like myself, I didn't know necessarily that I could go into academia as as an Asian person. You may not see a lot of Asian lecturers. Obviously, I did have someone that was great for representation, but not everyone has that. So really thinking, okay, how can we reach people and go, you can become a lecturer too. It doesn't matter what your background is. You can also become a lecturer and be in higher education in that way.
Yeah.
We need anti-bias training for those who are on staff interview panels and, part of HR and stuff. And then when it comes to retaining staff, whether there's mentorship programs for people of color, whether it's kind of communities of people from certain backgrounds as well, so they don't feel isolated in their roles, and also ensuring that there are enough staff from different races so that it doesn't feel tokenistic that you've got the one token brown person or black person on your team. And also so the burden of workload doesn't fall to them and you don't have to expect them to be doing all the work because they have that lived experience, which can burn people out and then cause them to leave. So I think it's all about hiring and retaining staff, really.
Yeah. So obviously there was a massive disparity in terms of during the pandemic, how ethnic minorities were more at risk from COVID due to a multitude of factors. How do you think the pandemic has actually influenced students' feeling of belonging, particularly students of colour?
Yeah. So there's definitely some things out there around how, and I'm sure we can all feel this at times too, like kind of when things are more online, there can feel like less connection. It can feel like, you're just looking at this computer screen and as well, like, and I know this from my own lectures, is that so often you can't see each other, everyone at the same time. Either, the slides are up and so you can't see all your other, peers' kind of faces on screen, or even if you can only see a few, that kind of thing, or they're very small on your screen and you're still in your room alone at the end of the day. So it can feel there's like less connection. And as I was sort of saying earlier, having that connection is so important, a sense of belonging, that's really kind of vital. And if you're not seeing people as well, there might be less kind of visible kind of people from similar backgrounds, just be able to see that you're not alone, or that, oh, look, there's loads of other people that look like they're from a similar background to myself. But also then there's also things like we know that for some groups that there might be less access to online materials, less access to kind of reliable internet or laptops and things like that. We know that some groups are more impoverished than others. So that can then kind of really mean that some people can't be accessing things as they want to be, which also creates that like less sense of belonging. And then on top of all that, in COVID-19, there was a lot of kind of racial trauma and racism happening. You know, there was anti-Asian hate. There was everything to do with George Floyd and the anti-Black kind of violence and all that kind of movement. And so actually, you know, for some people, that would have been really, you know, really triggering, really tough, and actually would have potentially made them feel even more separate to their peers and to the faculty, and reduced that feeling of belonging, really. So I think COVID-19 impacted it in multiple ways.
So have you seen any data trends or longitudinal studies that sort of highlight the relationship between student belonging, racial representation, and then retention over time?
Yeah, so there was one that I was particularly looking at, Murphy et al. 2020, and they were looking at first year students, and they just did a really kind of brief targeted intervention for 1 hour where they would ask them to read stories of older year students who had felt like they didn't have a sense of belonging. And then they would kind of read that, digest that, write their own narrative about how they felt with their own sense of belonging, and then a letter to future first years to kind of pass that on in a sense. And they felt that actually their sense of belonging did increase. But also what was interesting in the longitudinal aspect was that actually there was an increased continuous enrollment over the next 2 years. So it was better retention. And it was such a simple, short intervention, a 1 hour intervention, and it created change for 2 years. It's amazing. So yeah, there definitely are some longitudinal studies out there. And I thought that was a particularly nice one because it really is highlighting such a brief thing has such a huge impact.
Yeah. And you mean you wouldn't think an hour could have such an impact, but it's quite striking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think there are any challenges that institutions face when they're trying to improve student belonging through increasing racial diversity? And how do you think that they can actually address these barriers?
Yeah, absolutely. I was doing another piece of research actually thinking about more about diversifying our curricula and stuff like that, and how we can actually do that as lecturers, because it does feel sometimes a bit of a keyword, but no one knows how to do it kind of thing. Yeah. And so, you know, some of the barriers and challenges by interviewing some staff that we kind of came across was that multiple factors. One was sort of having the time to even look into this stuff, at changing their lectures, adding in more diverse pieces of research, or, you know, looking back into the histories and going, you know, where has it been whitewashed, and actually where is there more diversity that we haven't included. You know, we also found that some lecturers did have some biases that actually, you know, did they feel comfortable talking about this stuff? Did they feel confident talking about this stuff as well? And then also sometimes it came out that some students even felt uncomfortable, or that's what lecturers perceived at least as well. So there were definitely barriers that were coming up, and to address these, sort of set out some recommendations about, well, to support with staff. You know, they could utilize CPD to increase their knowledge and their confidence, and maybe reduce some of that their bias that they might feel. And also management and leadership in the departments need to really help to create a strong culture and climate where diversity is celebrated and you know, is what's wanted in the department, and to allow time for staff to create those diverse resources as well. So to block out those time in their workload models and things like that. I'm hoping to publish this research very soon. It's not out just yet, but it's I think it provides hopefully some ideas for what we can do, because I think often we do feel a bit stuck as institutions as to how to, you know, increase racial diversity, either whether that's actually in terms of the people in the team, or just even those who are on the team. How do we increase their kind of cultural awareness as well?
Yeah. So obviously your own research will be coming out soon, but what other future research directions do you see as most critical for advancing sort of understanding of how race representation, systemic inclusion impact student belonging in higher education?
Yeah, I think you mentioned longitudinal studies, and I think more of those could take place. It'd be interesting to see over time what's working. And I think having research either longitudinal or kind of shorter in terms of specific methods, what elements, like we saw in that other study by Murphy et al. About that whole 1 hour intervention was so effective. That's great. Let's do more of that kind of research. Let's see what helps, what sort of representation we need, or any strategies that staff can do, or whether it was about hiring practices or retention of staff, like what works, and do we know it works long term? Like, let's do some longitudinal studies on that. Interesting if we could do more research on intersectionality. I did mention about some other things, some other characteristics there, like age, gender, and class, but let's see more of that research that looks at representation of those factors as well, because that definitely came out as a thread in our research that we perhaps weren't anticipating necessarily, but loads of students were talking about that, and for some of them that actually felt more relevant than race, for example. And just including where we can students as researchers, and having those opportunities where students, particularly those from minoritized ethnic backgrounds themselves, can be involved. And as I've mentioned, we were really happy that we had students working with us on this particular project, because it gave us a slightly different viewpoint even, and the way that they may have interpreted things while we were doing thematic analysis, absolutely could have been impacted by the fact they were recent students or were current students, whereas myself and the other member of staff haven't been students for a little while. So actually that's something else we've published. We've just it's just publishing out in May, about the importance of staff-student partnerships and how important that is, and how we can all learn from each other, even staff learning from our students. There was loads that we learned, and just trying to create a very non-hierarchical kind of dynamic. But that's important as well, to have students involved, and it's a really, really lovely process. So that should be coming out, very soon, if not already.
It sounds like you've got a lot of research coming out, and of promising topics. But thank you for bringing attention to such a really critical part of belonging in higher education. I think a lot of people will gloss over it, particularly if they don't quite understand themselves, being a minority, that they've never had that experience of feeling like they don't belong in a room full of people. So thank you so much for this.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is really important. And it's not something that we always think about necessarily. Even if you are a person from a minority ethnic background, you may not even notice this explicitly. But just in the background, it's all churning away, and absolutely could be having an impact on your experience without even realizing it. It's important.
Thank you for joining on my podcast, Anjali.
Cool. Thank you so much, Felicity. It's been great.
Thank you for listening to the Connected podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out the rest of our extraordinary Voices of Belonging collection and stay connected.